Hey everybody, in today's episode, we're going to be analyzing a lecture of Manly Hall's titled, I Beg to Differ with the Darwinian Theory. And in this lecture, Manly Hall is going to be revisiting some of the topics that we've been discussing in the past several episodes, which pertain to the topic of scientific materialism and this idea that we need to overcome scientific materialism by transforming the way we understand the relationship between science and religion, and also the way that philosophy integrates with science and religion. So the three form a type of trinity. But as we treat them now, religion and science are treated as fundamentally separate things. And this idea of isolating them is what leads us into problems. And this was true in the day of Orthodox religion, to think the pre-scientific age in which there was religion separated from science. Now we have the inverse of that arising. We have a science that's become separated from any concept of religion or any concept of the spiritual life. So in a previous era, life was dominated by a religious orthodoxy, and in the current era, it's dominated by a scientific orthodoxy. And the underlying idea here is that in order to overcome orthodoxy and dogmatism on either side, we need to find a way to link these things so that religion is informed by science and vice versa. So I want to point out that in this lecture, Manly Hall uses the topic of Darwinian theory and the Darwinian approach to evolution, which you can associate with this idea of genetic determinism. He uses this as a proxy with which to talk about scientific materialism, or the paradigm of scientific materialism in general. So even though we're going to be discussing some of the ideas of Darwinian theory and comparing them with esoteric philosophy's approach to the origin of mankind and nature and man's evolution in nature, in a sense, this debate is a proxy by which you can discuss the larger issues that go beyond just the evolutionary topic. So there are bigger things that we're going to be discussing here beyond just Darwinian evolution. So just keep that in mind. Let's begin by kicking things off where Manly Hall begins in his introduction to his own lecture. So here we go.
A conflict has arisen in society which no one really expected. And at the present time, two hypotheses concerning the origin of man have come into a collision. This collision course is particularly discomforting to the scientific community because it has been generally assumed throughout the fields of higher education that we were safely, solidly, and serenely Darwinian in our explanations of the origin of human life. To suddenly find that it's not true, or it is being questioned, is a shock which is creating considerable repercussions in various walks of society. Now, the first question we may ask is, why has this particular issue come into focus? I think for one reason, for nearly 100 years, science has been the white hope of the world. We have assumed that science was going to lead us into the golden age, that science was going to bring about world peace, world security, world wealth, that everything was going to go very well, and that there was no need for us to contemplate any spiritual mystery in the background of life. This attitude has changed markedly since the development of nuclear armament. We suddenly begin to question the moral integrities of the scientific hypotheses. We begin to question whether the advancements of science are going to produce the improvements in humanity itself that have been taken for granted down through the years.
So here we're introduced to an idea that we're going to be developing more in this lecture, which is concerned with the fall of morality and ethics that is associated with the rise of secular science. And so what we have basically is a class of individuals who have replaced the priesthood, the custodians of the religious orthodoxy. We now have a new class of individuals that have come to be associated with this term, the technocracy or the technocratic elite. This new class of individuals who have become custodians of this secular scientific or scientific materialism, this knowledge that is used to design technologies and design systems that are oriented towards control of material resources and the material aspect of human life. This group of people is operating without a ethical or moral guidebook or disciplinary structure. And without this, they fall into a pattern whereby they end up creating technologies and pursuing ideas that actually end up becoming antisocial and are mechanisms by which humanity's own existence is threatened. And he gives the example of the atomic bomb. And now, decades later, after this lecture was originally given, we can look at all the modern problems associated with the technocratic situation that we're in and the idea of full societal control mechanisms being implemented using these sort of technocratic ideas and justified by this secular worldview. In this next clip, he's going to talk about some of the failures of this technocratic class, this elite group of custodians of secular science and the world that they've created.
We are also more or less frustrated in the development of scientific instruments and methodologies. We are now highly involved in the computer and the development of various electronic circuits, etc. All these processes are fascinating to the young, but they do not solve most of the essential problems of humanity. In fact, they ignore them. The computer, instead of contributing perhaps to the solution of human employment, is going to create more unemployment. Progress is a way of substituting machines for people, and these machines will ultimately result in a very tragic lack of employment for the human race itself. Also, scientific development of armaments has become a fear factor in human nature. We are more or less convinced that as the result of scientific progress, we are now in a condition and a position in which we could completely obliterate humanity. Now, this does not sound like progress. It sounds more like annihilation. And we begin to wonder why a highly intelligent strata of humanity is willing to go on like this. Why there seems to be no reason in their thinking to slow down destruction or the causes of it. The entire problem is one in which the mind must do what it pleases, whether it results in confusion, chaos, or destruction. Now, a great many millions of human beings who were very much enamored of science have suddenly questioned it. And unfortunately, the scientific community is not rising in a proper manner to defend its own position. Rather, it has a tendency to ignore the wishes, the will, and the fears of the great majority of human beings. They are not responsive to the cries of millions of frightened neighbors and associates. They go serenely on their way on the grounds that that type of progress is inevitable, that it must come, and that any human being who slows it down is a traitor to progress.
I want to point out that one thing that is, I think, a driver of this trend is the fact that there is a political dynamic that is an ongoing thing, a geopolitical dynamic. And that is one that is ultimately governed by the philosophy of full spectrum dominance. So it's a competitive mindset that's enacted at the state level and is one in which if you aren't the master of technology and the master of controlling all domains within the physical realm, that your enemy could instead become the controller of those domains and then get an edge up on you. So there's a sort of a race to the bottom. And this technocracy and the ideas underlying the technocracy and this justification to develop technologies and weapon systems and control systems at all costs and to herd everybody into these systems, I think is in large part driven by this full spectrum dominance psychology, this competitive psychology of geopolitics and statesmanship. But underlying all of it is this secular mindset. It's this identification with the material, physical world as being the ultimate reality, and that all the ends of human life are to be pursued on this one plane. And the underlying idea that Manly Hall is promoting is that this world is actually a platform for experiences to be had, but actually the true measure of growth and evolution and the thing that we should be keeping in mind is this underlying spiritual reality that underlies the material world. And so if you maximize your orientation during your physical embodied life toward controlling things in this world of physical embodied material things, your orientation is wrong. You're missing the whole point of your own existence here on earth. And so we exist to grow and to serve that spiritual light within, and to ultimately to fashion ourselves as instruments for that spiritual light. And when we act in this manner that the technocracy acts in, we are instead doing the opposite. We are, in a sense, closing ourselves off to that inner light, and we are trying to maximize our control over this realm of matter. And this is inherently a futile thing because we're all going to have to die. So you don't get to take with you what you've worked so hard to control and to earn on this material plane. So if your orientation isn't to serve the light within, your orientation is wrong. And that's the ultimate theme that we're going to be playing with here, is this idea that we're misguided in our scientific secularism. Now we're going to be moving on to investigating the religious orthodoxy and the failures of religion.
Now, on the other side of the coin, what are we going to do about the religious group? Now, religion has one difficulty in this particular point. Religion has not yet been able to consolidate its own strength. Religion has not yet come to the realization of the unity of the concept of God. Religions still have interpretations that are in conflict. Now, conflict in interpretation is due largely to the absence of basic fact, or it can arise from language differences or from social and climatic differences. But regardless of the origin, the various parts of the religious community cannot cooperate effectively, or at least they do not cooperate at the present time. Therefore, we have several major world religions, all dedicated to the same moral and social ends, all very largely worshiping the same concepts of divinity and its operations in creation, yet unable to meet upon any common ground. And why this inability to meet? It is the result of a long traditional theological structure in which each faith firmly believes that it was predestined and foreordained to rule the world. Now, this type of situation is the great weakness of religion.
So the root problem here that Manly Hall is discussing with religion is dogmatism. And the dogmatism comes from a literal acceptance that Scripture is describing absolute truth. So given that different sects have different scriptures that they adhere to, this makes these groups fundamentally incompatible with each other because each thinks their own set of scriptures is the absolute truth. And in a way, the modern scientific situation is similar in that the dogmatism of modern science is based on a literal acceptance that the world that scientists are describing is the world as it is, rather than the product of a series of hypotheses that have been bundled into a framework. So the idea here is the map versus the territory. Actually, what scientists are doing are describing a map. And this map is ever improving. The whole point of the scientific method is to ever refine this map. So we have a more and more accurate model of how the laws of this vast energy system that we call nature function. And instead, the secular orthodoxy of modern science, the technocracy, in other words, have adopted this view that the concepts of science are literal truths that have been worked out to completion. And so we must obey these interpretations based on this scripture of scientific laws and equations, and the sort of priesthood or the custodians of this new scripture of scientific dogma is this technocratic elite. So to speak against this technocratic elite is to be doing a type of blasphemy that today is called disinformation or misinformation. So you are eligible to be censored or deplatformed in this modern orthodoxy in a way that you would be persecuted and otherwise silenced in the previous orthodoxy if you were to speak out against the literal interpretation of the scriptures of the religion. So there's a parallel that I hope you're seeing here. Now, the problem with the literal interpretation is that you don't ever deal with the underlying mysteries, the experiential aspect of religion, or the mysteries in the scientific concept of what are these actual things that we're seeing and describing in our scientific equations and our scientific theories. We have theories, but we don't have actual knowledge about what is energy, what is consciousness from a fundamental level. And these are really philosophical concepts that go beyond dogmatism. So these ideas are what Manly Hall is going to be getting at in this next clip.
Before we can tell how life operates, we must answer the question, what is life? What is this energy? What is spirit? What is mind? What is consciousness? What is energy? What is force? We all realize that these processes, these aspects of existence exist. But we are not yet in a position to find a dogmatic definition for any of them. We have not yet come to the realization of the nature of the ultimate cause of things. Science doesn't know what it is, and theology doesn't know what it is. Theology has been locked in theological structures which have differed as to the nature of God sufficiently to create creeds, sects, and religious divisions. Science has not been any more successful, and here are the two groups. Science trying to get out of the dilemma by denying the existence of conflict, and religion trying to get out of the dilemma by continually warring in order that one can control the others.
Now in this next clip, we're going to be honing in on the Darwinian theory and exploring that as a type of case study for these larger themes that we've been talking about. So there's two different opposing theories of why do we see these different kingdoms of life and nature and how did they evolve. And so the Darwinian approach is focused purely on the physical level and posits only material existence. So it's this genetic determinism concept. And then this other view incorporates this idea of epigenetics, that there's something beyond the physical that is shaping and influencing how the physical genome and the structures of the body are formed. So these are two opposing views.
Today, we have a problem. How did man come into existence? what is the story of life? What is the story of existence? And I think we all acknowledge, definitely, that the development of the concept of evolution has been useful. Evolution was a more or less obvious answer to a problem that is not obvious. Evolution was a neat way of assuming a sequential progress of life through the various forms of nature in an ascending order from the molecular through the mineral, the plant, the animal, and into the human kingdom. Some years ago, a discussion was held concerning the possibility of man being a product of the animal kingdom. That somewhere in the remote past, what was been called the missing link, pictured by a very interesting composition by the artist Gabriel Max, that there was a missing link between man and the animal, and that this link was a bridge, and that across this bridge animals moved to become human. And humanity is more or less an advanced animal creation, and that it has therefore the visible components of an animal existence, but something is different. Now this seemed to be such a neat and trite statement that it was accepted instantly and presented us with the solution to certain secondary procedures in nature, but nothing to do with primary. Even if we prove conclusively that life moves through these kingdoms in an ascending order, we still do not know what that life is, nor do we know why it ascends through these various levels of expression. If we wish to assume another hypothesis, it's true, the unfoldment of form in nature through the various kingdoms as we recognize them, apparently the final purpose of this unfoldment is the creation of bodies, and that these bodies become the vehicles of energies and forces superior to themselves. It is becoming practically untenable in the knowledge that we possess today to assume that the body and the person in the body, that these two constitute one identical being. The body and the person are separate. The person may function through the body and may gradually mold the body into the likeness of its own purposes, but the person and the body are separate beings. Science is reluctant to accept this because to do so would permit the mind to conjure with the thought that if the person is separate from the body, that person can have existence apart from the body. And this is a more or less heretical position in terms of science. For scientifically speaking, however, psychology is producing a wedge, by means of which it is making it obvious that it is conceivable that the person and the body have separate existences, and that what we would call embodiment is the entry of a pre-existing pattern into a material existence. If this is the case, and there seems to be increasing support of this belief, then it would follow that various levels of life would be embodied in various levels of bodies. This again presents the scientist with a problem because he would then have to concatenate life itself. He would have to assume that bodies are symbols of the degree of life that is within them. This would mean that the life in the mineral would be less evolved than the life in a plant, and that the life of an animal would be less evolved than the life of a human being. Thus we would have an evolution of a life through a series of forms or bodies suitable to the expression of that form of life. This constitutes a more or less philosophical approach and more or less agrees with the opinions of antiquity.
On my channel, I talk a lot about the trinity of spirit, soul, body, and how these three interplay together as a trinity, or as a triangulated set of principles. And essentially, the philosophical view of evolution that he's arguing is one that takes into account this idea that the spirit moves into manifestation through the vehicle of the soul. And then the soul moves into expression through the vehicle of body, of the physical form or the material form. So the spirit moves into soul, and then soul fashions body. And so the evolution that takes place, the causation that underlies why and how physical forms are developed in the way they are, is a product of dynamics taking place in the soul and moving down into the material world of form, i.e. the body. And so the physical bodies that are fashioned are products of dynamics that are taking place within the soul. And they are expressions of the soul's state of integration at any given point. And this whole approach interfaces with this idea that I talk about in my Atlantis zine of the 7 ages. And the idea that creation exists as a cycle, one vast cycle that has an ultimate destiny to end in a state of unified existence. And then also it begins in a state of unified existence. But in this intermediate part in which the cycle is playing out, the soul will express itself in 7 ages and through 7 continental distributions and through 7 forms of the human kingdom. And that these different forms of the human kingdom offer different vehicles by which the soul can express itself during these 7 great ages of its own evolution. So the underlying idea here is that it's the soul that's fashioning the body, and the soul is ultimately the agent of causation that leads to the evolution of forms in nature. It's not, as Darwin says, which is a genetic determinism idea, which is that the dynamics of interacting matter are what lead to matter evolving material. So it puts the causation in the world of matter, and it doesn't posit this idea that there is a soul or a spirit underlying matter. And I also want to point out, he notes that psychology as a scientific discipline is acting as a kind of wedge by which to get beyond this scientific materialism and this genetic determinism and this Darwinian concept. And we remember that the word psyche means soul. So psychology is the science of the soul. So in this next clip, Manly Hall is going to talk about some of this that we just touched on, which is the basic pattern of reality that underlies this opposing view of evolution, the one that opposes the Darwinian concept. And it's going to talk about this idea of an underlying unified life, a divine being, or one creative power underlying existence. And so I like this series of quotes here.
Is there a life that moves through races, nations, creatures, orders of existence, like a thread moving through a string of beads? Is there one life behind all apparent diversities of life? Some theologians, including Aquinas, have been of the opinion that there is only one life, and that finally and ultimately that life is the life of deity. That there is only one source of life and one source of universal energy, and that is this intangible, mysterious being or power or principle which we call God, which was a kind of great sea of eternal energy in which everything exists, has existed, and will exist throughout eternity. So it has been generally assumed by the more thoughtful of the philosophically minded people that in truth and substance a divine being consisting of complete, unconditioned consciousness, intelligence, and energy has been at the source of existence. What this is in absolute definition, we do not know. But we find it possible, convenient, and almost inevitable to regard it as deity, the one final, ultimate fact of existence. To the Pythagoreans, and in their school of thinking, there is, and always has been, only one life in space. This one life in space manifests through an infinity of differentiations, with everything that is conceivable or unconceivable to man is part of the potential of this one life. This one life is all and one. All as the total of everything that exists. In one life, all things live and move and have their being. This one life cannot be analyzed by any of the fragments of itself, but it is the source of all fragmentation. This one life is not only the source of all bodies, but of minds, of souls, of spirits, and of every type of differentiation that exists in space. This one life, then, is the totality of all of the manifestations of itself, plus the nature of its own identity, which is known only to itself.
So having now introduced and compared and contrasted and differentiated the three main themes that we're dealing with, which are the differences between philosophy, science, and religion, we're going to be delving a little bit more now into how the worldviews and dynamics of religion and science differ from one another. And the focus is going to be on the idea that science investigates the outer world and that religion investigates the inner life. So we're dealing with a concept of religion now that's trying to move beyond dogmatism and looking at religion as an experiential phenomenon that has to do with, as Jung would say, encounters with the archetypes of the unconscious. And the mythologies have to do with the dynamics of those.
Science and philosophy and religion all rose together in antiquity, and were only separated in a comparatively recent period of time. This brings philosophy into focus as the power to bring together the scientific and the religious points of view. As philosophy becomes the reconciler of opposites, it becomes, in a sense, the mediator between all extremes in life. Neither science nor religion actually has the full understanding of the mystery of existence. The problem is that to science, the ultimate is a completely impersonal energy. To the theologian, the ultimate is a purposed conscious energy. It is something that is alive and meaningful and purposeful. There are two polarities involved here. Science searching for reality from the outside, religion searching for reality from the inside. To the religious person, the experience of faith is all important. To the scientist, the experience of fact is all important. We can explore the universe scientifically only on the plane of physical existence. We can send probes further and further into space, but no matter how far we go, there will still be space, and we will not know why it is there or what its purpose is. On the other hand, if we use faith and search more and more deeply into ourselves for the answer, we discover by a mystical experience or an apperception from within our own natures, we discover certain convictions, certain feelings, certain sensory reactions, which all add up to a sense of great believing, of faith.
And now in this next clip, we're going to be looking at the implications of the secular worldview of the scientific age that we live in, and the ethical and moral collapses associated with this rejection of religion and this putting everything into the scientific worldview, which advocates essentially the idea that we should be attempting to study and control and dominate the material universe in lieu of all other possible pursuits that we could be exploring. And because it has detached itself from religion, it doesn't have any feedback in terms of the ethics and morality of its own actions.
The scientific point of view is that when we conquer the physical universe, we can achieve our final liberation from ignorance. The difficulty in this point of view is that there seems to be no probability that we are going to conquer the universe. What we call conquering is merely exploring and creating of hypotheses. Whatever we discover leads to another discovery, but the reality eludes us all. So science is content to go on exploring the physical dimensions of the universe, and would like this to be passed on as the proper purpose for education in our public school systems. Namely, that we are to respect facts above all other considerations. Now, the scientific point of view has greater strength or validity if we wish to take the scientific position that the survival of life after death is an illusion. If the individual at the end of his present life ceases forever, and there is nothing to be gained by any idealism or any effort to release values within himself which do not have any existence except in his own mind, if this is true, then the conquest of the material becomes the sole objective of humanity. It can do no more than try to write a full description of the physical existence in which it exists. The scientific point of view, then, would impel us to advance various forms of sciences, some of which are very useful, some of which are not very useful. But the final answer is not just the scientific fact, it is utility. It is the value of it in use. If you remove from scientific progress moral integrities, you get into a very serious condition. Knowledge without integrity is deadly. No matter what skills we possess or develop, if we are not motivated to the proper use of them, and not impelled by some power within ourselves to avoid the misuse or abuse of these discoveries, we will gradually undermine existence and destroy the forms of life which we have inherited from the past. Science is inventing a kind of progress with which the human being cannot cope, and which will ultimately result in a general destruction. As materialistic education lowers morality, we perceive in daily living the consequences. We are moving into an era of crime and corruption practically unknown in history. We have taken away from the individual the censorship of integrities. We have taken for granted that it is not whether we are good or bad that is important. It is which side has the heaviest artillery. And physical strength and the cunning to create it are the all-important elements of survival. This is simply untrue. These are the dangers which hazard survival. What does the Darwinian theory give us or give young children who must face a life of international conflict, political corruption, economic uncertainty, and social decline. What does the Darwinian theory do to help those going to school to build lives that are purposeful? What is it going to do to him to be a materialist, to decline to accept as superstition anything that is not obvious to his five senses and the scientific community? The answer is it's going to do him very little good. He will never find security in any of the advancements of science. One thing it can do for him, and that is it can help him to protect, preserve, and use the body that he has. Theoretically, science can help us, but it can help us principally on the level of body. It can help us to use the structure that we have and to repair it if it is in danger of sickness or dissolution. It can help. But as far as the scientific point of view, giving us personal integrity, giving us happiness in our homes, giving us better-oriented children, and a willingness to cooperate for a common good, it does not help us to solve international conflicts. It does not help us to improve political relationships. It does not make our statesmen more honest. It does not make our citizens more frugal or cooperative. All of these things are outside of the scientific domain. As the depression increases, as unemployment rises, as human securities are threatened, what is science doing to meet the emergency? It is going to continue what it has always done, to advance scientific skills and try to convince us that if it can put a man on Pluto, that all is well in the world.
So there he noted that some of the consequences of a science detached from religion and its lack of moral and ethical foundation is that we have social collapse, we have societal collapse, and we have the empowerment of this full spectrum dominant psychology in which man dominates nature and certain groups of humans dominate other groups of humans. Everything's objectified because nothing is ensouled. So now in this next clip, he's going to talk about the solution has to be the re-ensouling of science, that science has to be reconnected with a sense of idealism, which comes from religion and philosophy. It needs that sense of larger mission and purpose in order to guide its activities back on a path that is in harmony with the greater good of mankind and with the greater plan and purposes of creation itself.
So there is something necessary. And this necessary element is a communion between science and idealism. Idealism's principal exponent at the present time is religion. Religion is that factor in our behavior pattern by which we are motivated to the proper use of that which we know. Now, if we could come to a mutual understanding with religion and science, in which the two decide to work together, science probing and bestowing upon religion the dignified right of interpreting all discoveries in terms of human good, science has to become moralistic. It has to place censorship upon itself. It has to apply to its own achievements a golden rule of integrities. No science is important or valuable until it is ensouled. Ensouling the science means its dedication to the service of human need. Science does not exist to glorify itself. It does not exist to create profit for corporations. Science exists primarily to improve humanity's relationship with itself on the levels of family, home, health, and other problems. Science must be ensouled, or soullessly it will destroy itself.
So now that we've accepted this need for science to become re-ensouled with religion, Manly Hall is going to offer a framework here of mankind's place within this universal scheme and discuss how an ensouled science can be reflected in a sense of idealism about the meaning and purpose of human life and about the ultimate ends to which we should redirect our scientific focus. And these ends involve the concept of the spirit and the soul.
Here we are as individuals in a world of which our bodies are largely dominated by science and our hearts and minds largely inclined toward religion. And in the midst of this situation is this grave question at the moment, a question that has really very little significance, as to the nature of our own essential beings. What is man, says the Scripture, that thou shalt be mindful of him? Well, what is man? What is humanity? Scientifically, he is merely a precocious biped without feathers. According to theology, he is the noblest production of deity. Actually, what is the human being and how should he view himself? If he doesn't respect his own nature, if he doesn't have any convictions that are worthwhile, how can he regulate and control and direct his own life? In looking around into the animal kingdom which surrounds us, we observe that between the human being and the animal, there is an incredible, insurmountable obstacle. There is no way of assuming that the human being is simply a highly sophisticated animal. Between man and the animal, there are certain differences which is impossible to cross. One of these differences is thought, the individual power of the mind. In order to be human, the individual has memory. He has also the power mentally of projecting a future, which gives him the privilege to improve, change, and modify his own existence. The human being is the only creature that we know in the visible world which is capable of self-directive, that is capable of dominating a situation, and most of all, of verbalizing it. Speech has separated man from the animal from the beginning. And while the animal is a very lovable and wonderful creature in many instances, it is not right, either to us or to the animal, for us to assume that we are directly bound to them by a biological factor. Let us assume then the fact as it is, that two orders of evolution are working at the same time in nature. One is physical evolution. Here Mr. Darwin had something on his mind, and he really made an important contribution. In other words, nature is continually unfolding bodies, and these bodies move from one degree of efficiency to another, and the most efficient and complex and useful physical body ever created is that of the human being. Physical evolution is producing nobler mansions, but there is not anything to indicate here that this physical evolution does control that which is in the body. The ancients would have agreed, largely, that evolution of form is inevitable and proper, but that the evolution of life through form is a separate function. That which form makes possible, the house that form builds, has its proper occupant. And each order of life is a level of internal life development and unfoldment. Therefore, what we call the human being is not the body, but the life moving through that body. A life which has fashioned gradually the form we call human through long periods of evolution, and a life which adjusts the new body with each embodiment to the needs and characteristics and qualities of its own purposes. Therefore, the higher form of evolution is the evolution of life. The lower form is the evolution of bodies. These two work together. And each time an embodiment occurs, that which enters in belongs to the proper level of life. It is the human soul that makes the human being possible. It is the animal soul that makes the animal possible. Both points of view have certain integrities, but to attempt to unite them and assume that the body and the dweller in the flesh, that these are identical, is against practically every system of rationalistic thinking the world has ever created. The human being is human and is born and bred by human parents and receives its gift of a human life spark. And this humanity is that which inhabits the body after the quickening and gradually molds it into the purposes of the incarnating entity. What we call consciousness is our own experience of the function of the life principle within us. For us, consciousness expresses itself through the ego, through the mind, through the emotions, through the vital resources of the body. And it is this dweller in the flesh that helps us to choose our careers, that helps us to decide and evaluate experiences, and this factor helps us to grow inwardly through the internalization of things that happen in our environment. In other words, the purpose of the body is to help the power in the body to become more and more sufficient to its own needs. But the fact of the matter is that unless we are here for a purpose, the entire existence of living things has no meaning whatsoever. And having no meaning, there is no hope. For if there is no meaning, no reason, no methodology by which anything can be accomplished, then we live and die in a state of complete bewilderment and have been exploited from the cradle to the grave. Such is not the case, fortunately, for all concerned. If we then assume, as is almost necessary, that there is something beyond the present, then in a large measure the whole structure of science falls apart. Because if there is something more in life or to life than the immediate frenzied accumulation of wealth or power, then we have been living falsely from the beginning, and science has been trying to build up something that cannot survive. It is therefore very important for us to try to ensoul the world in which we live. And I think that really, of the animals and other kingdoms of nature, man becomes symbolically a conscious ensoulment of life, as this ensoulment develops on this level of existence. In other words, man represents, more or less, a soul power in the material world. The power of inner consciousness, inner dedication, inner understanding and realization to transmute and transform the outer environment into an appropriate and proper place for the development of life. The human being has tremendous potentials. These potentials include a number of faculties, not only of communication, but of memory, of ideation, of internal mysticism. it makes possible the rise of esoteric disciplines, sciences, and philosophies. It definitely indicates that gradually the human being is able to take over his own destiny. This is something that sets him entirely apart from every other kingdom of nature. There is no other kingdom that we know that can create a future destiny for itself by intent, that can take the rough materials of life and ensoul them with purposes beyond survival. The other kingdoms are largely tied into a survival pattern, which is always present, is always dominant, and requires practically the entire life of the living creature. The animal kingdoms live in one or two principles alone. They have to feed, they must have nutrition, and they have to generate and reproduce. Food and reproductive power constitute the burden which all kingdoms below man must carry. Now, this doesn't mean that man doesn't have to carry them also, but it means that man is capable of a complete life above them. The human being is not required to spend all of his life feeding himself, and that alone, nor is he required to exist only to the point of generation or perpetuation of species and then an immediate departure. The human being has other overtones which must be developed or can be developed by the proper aptitudes and the proper dedications. The human being has a life fulfillment within itself. It has a duty to itself, which is another form of nutrition. Man's material nature perpetuates the species. Man's soul perpetuates and unfolds itself by a psychic nutrition, the nutrition of ideals, of dreams, of hopes, of aspirations, and of dedications. The individual nourishes the inner life by the merits of its own conduct, by its dreams, its aspirations, and its dedications. So that this means definitely that the human being was created or fashioned or evolved, or whatever you want to call it, for a purpose that is unique in nature. It is because of this uniqueness in nature that the human being controls or is capable of controlling every other form of life. It cannot create another form of life, but it can direct it, unfold its resources, it can curb it or expand it, it can give it greater opportunity or destroy its privileges. The human being is in a strange way, is the leader of this herd of souls that we find embodied in the kingdoms of nature. Therefore, man is a unique creature. It is not possible to assume that we can explain man merely as an animal with one step further ahead.
In that extended clip, Manly Hall made the case that mankind is this aspect of the universal soul that has a special purpose in place. And that is the key element that we need to embrace in this larger spiritual framework of life that we're going to incorporate as we go forward. And so the idea is that not only do we live in a spiritual universe, but that mankind has a spiritual purpose. And that as parts of mankind, each of us has a particular place and purpose in this larger universal scheme. So in this upcoming final clip, Manly Hall is going to just reemphasize the fact that this needs to be emphasized in our education and in our culture. And I completely agree. This kind of goes into what I was doing in my previous video, Man in Search of a Myth, or Modern Man in Search of a Myth, where I was discussing the idea that we need a new mythology that incorporates religion and science and philosophy as this triumvirate of human institutions that are intended to be aligned together and not treated as separate and competing structures. So Manly Hall is going to talk about the pressing necessity to have a philosophy of life that is idealistic and that incorporates these larger spiritual principles, and to have this larger view replace the secular materialism, which takes away all idealism. And my personal feeling and the motivation that got me to spend so many years studying these topics is that I set out to create an approach to organizational design. And organizations are run by management. And so for me, design is a philosophy of understanding mankind's place within society and within the larger system of nature, and then a larger cosmic scheme. And this philosophy of life is one that is ensouled. It has these ideas that we've been talking about of spirit and soul incorporated within them, and that these must be guiding directives in this philosophy of life that is articulated through the language of design. And so I think that this movement of this re-education process and how it can be actualized to the most effect is to formulate it in a way that it can become embodied and enacted and carried out as a revolution in management thinking and management philosophy. Because if you have that, then the organizational structures of the world can be reoriented and re-engineered toward pursuing the goals of philosophy. And so that's my take, is that all these ideas are going to have the most impact if they can be targeted toward the specific groups. I mean, they need to be targeted towards everybody, but specifically targeted towards the groups who can leverage them for the most immediate and scalable impact, which is management, executive management, strategic decision-making. And the overall emphasis is to move from a competitive mindset, which is what the Darwinian approach emphasizes, to a cooperative mindset, which is what idealistic philosophy emphasizes. So anyway, that's my take. I got this last clip coming up, and then I'm going to wrap it up. So thanks very much for tuning in. And this was the final official episode as part of this extended series on the zine I put together, Psychology of the Science of the Soul. So please check that out if you haven't yet. And I'm going to take a little bit of a break, maybe for a week or two. I'm going to break ground on my next publication process, and but I'll be back with some more material soon. So thank you very much again. God bless.
Young people today, and older folks too, need some form of motivation which will enable them to live above and beyond physical pressures. To lock the soul within the body after it has been given dominion over it is a sad mistake. We have missed the entire purpose of our existence. The soul is not being permitted to perform its essential duty of directing the life within the person and protecting the body in which that life is enclosed. So man has to improve from within out. He has to lead from the soul and not from the body. He has to use the mind and emotions to advance the universal good and not merely to further little small selfish projects of his own. And young people should be told this. They should not be so much concerned as to where they came from in terms of the Darwinian theory, but where they're going in terms of cosmic purpose. This is the emphasis. Every young person should be taught the dignity of his own contribution to life. He should be taught that there is within him something that he can use to better others and serve himself in this way. That he is not here simply to get rich or powerful. He is not going to be a success because he is a computer operator. He is here to grow not only in skills but in grace. And his skills should be under the domination of his integrities. The more proficient he becomes in some line of activity, the greater the contribution he can make to enduring good, not merely to some passing project that seems to have economic possibilities. We have great need to give young people reason for life. A practical philosophy of life must justify life, must make it meaningful and worthwhile, must make also a program, a progress, which we can all share and all labor together for the common good. I think we have to realize that man is a living soul, that his body is of the earth, to which it will return, but his soul belongs to a higher order of life, which is moving triumphantly toward the perfection and service of the divine plan. We live in these two levels. We must balance them within ourselves. And if one is to gain advantage over the other, it must be the power of the soul to win the body, to take the body and make it an instrument of the purpose of that divine part of man, which is his hope of glory.